NetSuite users with complex environments share some common concerns. There is change being introduced in the environment due to customizations and integrations. Biannual release upgrades require validation of business processes. Finally, compliance requires testing of roles and permissions to ensure segregation of duties. We built Xcelero with these concerns in mind. Xcelero is certified built for NetSuite, which means that it is validated by NetSuite to meet its standards for suite apps at each release upgrade. From the outset, our focus has been to make Xcelero a tool that would be used by the business analyst or QA analyst for testing. With this in mind, the key features are an ability to capture test data with a single click. No record or replay is needed. Definition of success criteria uses saved searches, which are widely used. Execution is automated, so test cases once defined can be executed for regression as many times as needed. And above all of these can be done without writing any code. Let's drill down a little further. Xcelero makes defining test cases really easy. There is no need for complicated spreadsheets or recording and replaying any keystrokes. You simply capture test data from a representative web page in NetSuite. We say web page because it could be a transaction such as a purchase order, an entry form such as a customer, a custom form based on a custom record, or even a suitelet in your customizations. A special case of a test case is an integration. Xcelero has the ability to define connections to your integration platform as a service provider such as Dell Boomi and trigger a process to interact with another system. Having captured test data, you assemble discrete groups or process flows such as procure to pay. Groups are collections of discrete test cases, whereas flows represent a series of test cases that are related to each other. Our customers typically execute test cases in a sandbox or in their release preview environments. When a test case is executed, it is done as a specific user under a specific role. Test cases in groups or flows are saved so they can be executed whenever needed to test for regression. If there is an error that is reported at the time of execution, that can be logged directly in an issue management system such as Jira. Xcelero provides analytics by slicing and dicing test execution data by test cycle, process flow, users, and transaction types. Let's take a look at a simple test scenario as an example. In this scenario, a purchase order is created and submitted for approval by an employee, which is then approved by the controller. Using Xcelero, you would create a test case to create and save the purchase order, and then in the second test case, the controller would approve the purchase order. The success criteria are defined in the first step to check the status of the purchase order as in pending approval, and in the second test case to check it for a status of approved. Let's take a quick look at what an implementation of Xcelero looks like. We installed the bundle in production because that serves as the permanent home for the test case repository. Test case creation and execution occurs in a sandbox or release preview environment. Once the test cycle is complete, test cases are exported back to production. Let's take a look at Xcelero in action in this demonstration. When you are in the Xcelero administrator role, you have a test execution dashboard. The dashboard shows key performance indicators showing transaction types tested, test cases run and passed, process flows run and passed, and in addition, you see custom searches that provide more details on the number of test cases by transaction types and statuses. In the Xcelero admin menu, you have options for setup, for integration, for defining and editing test cases, for executing test cases, looking at information coming from Xcelero to help you analyze your test execution data, and data management in terms of exporting data to other environments or sending it back to production. Take a quick look at connectors here to see the, the integrations available from within Xcelero. So in this example, we have a connector to Dell Boomi that creates purchase orders based on flat files, and there's a connector to Jira that will create issues should any test cases run into errors. Let us look at how Xcelero helps you create test cases very quickly. So to start, if I have a purchase order that I want to recreate as a test case, I can pick it up from my recent records or from a saved search or by using the search box in any of these ways. Once I have that purchase order that represents a test scenario for me, I make a copy of it. So I have the data that I want to replicate on my screen, and then I click my browser extension and provide a name for that test case, provide a more detailed description as needed, and indicate to Xcelero that once this data has been populated at the time of execution, I want to save this transaction, and I say capture test data. That is all I need to do to capture test data for this purchase order test case. Having done this, I have the ability to immediately execute this test case using the Xcelero administrator menu. If I were to go to the execute tests, I see that I have options to run these test cases in a group or in process flows. So in my scenario, if I wanted to run this as a group, I can bring in the test case that I just created, the 501 create purchase order. I add it to my group here, and I'll add it 2 times just so that I can run a little test here based on permissions. So what I'm trying to do here is to run it under a specific user, such as Xcelero Acme 1, and in my first test case, I'm running it as a buyer, and I'm indicating that I want to confirm the success of this particular test case by running a saved search that says that this transaction was created successfully. In my second test case, I'm running it under the same user. However, I want to run it under the role of an AP clerk, and my segregation of duties rules say that I should not be able to have access to the purchase order transaction if I have the role of an AP clerk. So that would be a test to tell me if my permissions have been defined appropriately or not. So once again, my success criterion is my Xcelero purchase order saved search, and I say OK here. I give this test group a name and I save it. So this creates a test group that I can come back to and run at any time. So in our demonstration, I'm going to run it, provide my credentials, and I say continue. This is going to kick off the execution of my test group, which we'll come back to in a couple of minutes. The next thing I want to look at is the ability to create process flows. And how you create process flows is using the custom process flow function. Before this demonstration, I had created a set of test cases that I want to use in our example. So in my example, I'm testing a workflow, which basically means that if there's a purchase order that is over $1,000, it needs to be approved by somebody who has the role of a controller. So in my example, my first test case is that of a purchase order. So I have the purchase order entry test case that was previously created that has no predecessor. It is being run under, once again, let's say the Xcelero Acme user, but here I'm going to run it under a role such as a buyer. Again, my success criteria here can be that this purchase order has been submitted for approval, so the status needs to be pending approval. So my success criteria here is going to speak to that specific saved search. My next test case is to approve the purchase order, which means that when this purchase order is opened by a controller, so I'm going to pick the role of a controller, and in this case, after the controller has clicked approve on this purchase order, the status would change to approved. So you see how this simulates the workflow and gives you the ability to test it. So should any conditions change, should you make change to any logic along the way, does the purchase order approval still work or not? So obviously this is a very simple example. So I can give it a name such as 402 PO approval demo, and I save it. This creates a saved test group for me, just like it did for the purchase order group that we previously had. And I now have the ability to run it from here and do it in the same exact way that I did with the previous test case. So we just executed the custom process flow, which was a simulated PO using a workflow. So let's take a look at some of the success criteria that we used. So if we look at the Xcelero PO pending approval saved search as an example, what you're going to see is that this is a saved search which is very similar to the saved searches that you may have used before. The only difference is that we are checking the approval status to be pending approval, and the results are only looking to count the number of rows that meet that condition. So at the time of execution, we concatenate the recently created transaction along with the remaining criteria here. So if you have business logic that needs to be validated by way of comparing expected values against actual values, those conditions can be incorporated in the criteria. And Xcelero, after the test case has been executed, will look at the recently created transaction, apply these criteria, and if it comes back with exactly one row as the result of that saved search, then it would be considered a success. So that's what the saved search mechanism works as a success criteria in Xcelero. Let's take a look at some completed executions to see how you look at completed executions by way of pass-fail, by way of success criteria. So this one we had just submitted looks like completed with errors, and let's see what happened with it. So as you can see here, the first test case, which was to create the purchase order under the role of a buyer, passed, and this is the URL. If I click on it, control click to open a new tab, I can see that it brings me to the purchase order that was just created. We expected that it's going to be a replica of the purchase order that we previously used as an example. And if you look at the system information here, you can see that the Xcelero Acme user created it. So going back to my test execution details here, the second row where we submitted the same exact test case but under the Acme AP clerk, you see that it had a permission violation because the AP clerk is not supposed to have the access to the purchase order creation form. So if you look at the notes against this test case, you'll see there's a screenshot that speaks to the same error as was seen as you would see in case you ran into a permission violation in NetSuite. So this is a useful feature that shows you screenshots as if you're executing these test cases yourself, except that these are being run in the background and you don't have to sit and watch or sit and execute these test cases yourselves. In addition, you'll see that there are three different statuses to each test case. One is the test case status by itself. The second one is a success criterion status that says whether the saved search was successful or not. And the third one is a group status that shows you whether as a whole or as a group was this test case successful or not. If there is an error, as it was in this case, it is integrated with Jira in this environment. So it has already created an issue that can be logged in Jira which says that there is a permission violation. So there is no need for anybody to say that, okay, we have this error and now we need to track it in Jira, so create an issue. That integration is provided in this environment. We can integrate with other issue management systems as needed. We thank you for taking the time, and please contact us at info@xcelerobpv.com in case you have any questions. Thank you.